And moving on to the Tinder, everything we've talked about with the locomotive in terms of cleaning products, lubricating products, still applies to the Tinder. Although our process of service is going to be slightly different because the Tinder doesn't come apart quite as cleanly as the locomotive does. Now, differences between, say, a 2-rail and 3-rail Tinder for servicing is that on a 2-rail Tinder, you're going to have this bus bar here on the bottom, and of course this wire with the banana plug which plugs into the motor on the locomotive. On a 3-rail model, instead of the bus bar, you're going to have a center rail pickup roller right here. Now, in terms of servicing a super detailed model, which this one is, it has all the extra handrails, versus a modified Tinder, as Lionel called them, which are the 002s and the 004 Tinders. There's really no difference in terms of assembly or disassembly, except for these handrails on the end. You just have to make sure they go in the right spots. And if you're servicing a Tinder that does not have a whistle, for 3-rail, the Tinder is functionally no different than a freight car. You're going to want to have clean wheels and lubricated axles. And if you're doing a 2-rail non-whistling Tinder, same thing applies. Clean wheels, lubricated axles, but you're still going to have to address the wire here. This is still a critical part of a functioning 2-rail locomotive. To start off our Tinder servicing, we're going to start by removing the coal pile with 2 screws in the front and back. And the coal pile should just lift off. There's one more screw right here we're going to go ahead and remove while we're up here. It's a long one. It holds on the front truck plate with 2 other screws. Now we're going to flip it over and remove this bus bar. We're going to set it aside for cleaning. Now we're going to go ahead and remove this screw here. This holds on this insulator for the bus bar. Now, when we remove this insulator, pay attention to this little piece here. This is a solder lug, and that's what the screw that holds on the bus bar actually screws into. So when we lift it off, hopefully you can see how this piece basically has a cutout for that solder lug. Set that aside for cleaning. And there's a little fiber insulator here to keep that solder lug from touching the frame. Now, we'll go ahead and remove the front Tinder frame by removing these 2 flathead screws right here. And my trucks are a little dirty, so I'm going to go ahead and remove them from the frame. There is a shoulder screw with the shoulder insulating washer. This will pull off and reveal this insulator and a little contact plate. We'll set those aside for cleaning, as well as the truck. Now we'll come back to the rear Tinder frame. We're going to remove this screw here, and then again, the 2 Phillips flathead screws in the corners. And when you remove this, make sure you're watching out for the solder lug. It'll just pull out like that. Set that aside. And go ahead and, again, since I'm going to clean my trucks, I'm going to go ahead and remove, again, the shoulder screw and insulating washer there. And again, on the rear truck, we have one of these insulating plates and a contact plate. This is how you get power from the opposite rail of the locomotive and passed up to the locomotive. It goes from the trucks to the contact plate, through the bus bar, to the other front truck and contact plate, which has this wire attached which goes up to the motor in the locomotive. Right, I'm going to start off cleaning the whistle DC relay here. And you're going to want to be careful not to bend any of these contacts. And since all these are basically electrical parts, I'm going to be using mineral spirits. And these are basically the hinges here. You're going to want to clean inside those. And this is, again, one of the contacts. I'm just going to use a paper towel here. I'm going to slide it between the contacts, hold them together, and sort of rub it back and forth, and then pull it out. And you can see I've gotten a little bit of dirt off of there. Let's see if we can do it again. I'm going to slide that in, give it a little rub. There we go, and that looks pretty good. Again, just like the E-unit, there's no need for lubrication. And if you do have to take the DC relay out, there's a screw here and a screw down here. It's kind of a funny looking DC relay if you're used to the Lionel's normal size DC relay. This one is kind of short, and it has some contacts up here just like a normal one, although they're oriented a little differently. If you've never pulled one of those apart, I wouldn't bother. I would only do that if you really, really need to polish these contacts better than what we just did. Moving on to the actual whistle motor. Again, we have one of these magnet wires right here where if you're not careful and you bend it too much, it'll break. And again, if it breaks, you've basically ruined the whistle motor. So you most certainly want to go ahead and remove it. Now, in this case, I think because I've serviced this tender before, I managed to leave myself just a little hook so I don't have to completely remove this screw. The cats are wrestling down here. You may have to completely remove that screw if this wire is completely wrapped around it. That's not a big deal. You'll just have to watch the spring here and make sure you don't lose it, and make sure you can get it back together. I'm going to tighten that back down so I don't lose the spring. And we're going to remove 2 screws, hold the brush plate on. Now you can probably see there's some grease around the armature shaft there. Let's see what the commutator looks like when we get this brush plate off. Make sure you're watching for the brushes. They may come with the brush plate or stick on the commutator. And yeah, as you can see here, that commutator is pretty dirty. That's one of the problems with the whistle motor, is because you definitely want to oil that spot right there. Any oil, grease, or whatever you get drops down to the commutator and really makes it super dirty. Again, you're going to want to use mineral spirits here. I'll typically use a Q-tip, wipe it all off. The armature isn't going to come out. It's actually held in by this plate down here. If you were to remove this plate, you could actually pull the armature out, although I don't recommend removing the plate. There's a gasket behind here. When you remove this plate, you risk damaging that gasket, and then the whistle motor doesn't seal, or the whistle chambers don't seal, and you end up causing yourself more problems. Alright, I'm at the point where the motor has now been completely cleaned and it's ready for reassembly before we can move on to any other steps. I will say that I have pre-lubricated this bottom bearing, and I actually put it upside down and let it sit for a little bit so that the oil could drain down into the bearing. Another nice thing of not having the brush plate on, as I mentioned before, is that you can wiggle the armature shaft to help get the oil up into that bearing. Now this motor is almost identical to the locomotive motor, and I am going to assemble it almost identically. I used my Labelle 102 thick gear lubricant on the hole for the armature shaft and the brush plate. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I like to put the lubricant on the brush plate rather than the armature shaft. The reason for that is that when I put the brush plate on, any excess lubricant will be pushed up out of that hole by the armature shaft. Whereas if I were to put the lubricant on the armature shaft, when I put the brush plate on, the hole would scrape any excess lubricant down onto the commutator. So let's go ahead and get started. Because the motor is flat and reasonably stable, I'm going to go ahead and put my brushes on now, and then slide the brush plate on. Make sure the other wires are out of the way. And just make sure that the motor spins nicely. And we'll reinstall this wire that goes to the brush. So it's time to reassemble the frames and the Tinder trucks. Although if you're working on a 2-rail model like I am, I totally forgot to mention that you need to keep the orientation of the trucks. The reason for that is that the locomotive picks up power from only one rail. It receives power from the opposite rail from the tender. Now, if you look at the Tinder trucks, you can see in the video there's one side that's smooth and there's kind of another side that's rough here on the axles. Turns out the rough side is the insulated side and the smooth side is the pickup side. Now if you're like me and you can never remember that, or the roughness is hard for you to see because sometimes it's hard for me to pick up quickly, another test you can do is if you have a DMM with a continuity mode, you can of course connect one lead to the wheel, the other lead to the frame, and figure out which side is the pickup side that way. Although if you don't have a DMM that does that, and I find that that test is a little flaky sometimes, you can take a piece of track and place your locomotive on the track. And in this case, I have it set up facing that way because this is the side that the bakelite wheels are on. This is the insulated side of the locomotive, which means that this is the rail the locomotive needs transferred from the tender. Now you're going to want to take the locomotive off the track for this test. Have the tender trucks on the track, and I have one transformer lead connected to that rail. I have the other transformer lead attached to this light bulb here. If you don't have an extra light bulb, you can steal it from the headlight. Simply touch the light bulb to the truck frame, and if it lights, it's oriented properly for the current orientation of the locomotive. If it doesn't light, simply turn the truck around and check again. Once you have the orientation of the trucks, match the frames to the orientation of the locomotive. So this is the end that will connect to the locomotive. That's the end that will connect to our train. We're now ready to install the trucks onto the frames. And here's what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to take the contact plate, and it's got these little tabs on it. It will fit onto the insulator, just like that. It'll only go one way. One tab is bigger than the other. And without losing the orientation to our trucks, since we did that earlier, you're going to want to put this onto the frame, and this long tab on the insulator is going to fit into this slot. Get your shoulder screw and shoulder washer ready, and we're going to use the truck to help hold all that on. Align the screw hole, drop the screw in, tighten it down, check and make sure that that black plastic insulator is in the slot still, the truck moves freely, and this frame is about ready to be assembled onto the body. Also, I don't know if I mentioned I went ahead and lubricated the axles using that powdered graphite. So that's the rear tender frame. The front tender frame is pretty much the same. You have this wire coming off that is going to go to the front of the locomotive. It's going to fit through this big hole, like that. And we'll again use the truck to help hold everything on. Forgot to get my parts ready. There's my shoulder washer, shoulder screw. Alright, I think that's good. Alright, next I want to go ahead and replace this wire here. On this one, there's actually nothing wrong with it other than it's too long. But when you are servicing your locomotives, you'll probably run across this wire where the insulation is cracking and it'll need to get replaced. One thing to point out, you can see right about here there's a kink in the wire. What happens with almost every wire I see is that that bottom whistle plate fits right about there and it pinches that wire down. That happens to almost every wire I see, and so whenever I replace this wire, I try to use something pretty thin. Now to get the wire out of this banana plug, on this one, you're going to want to heat the end of the banana plug with your soldering iron and then pull the wire out from the back. I have seen another variation of these. It has a larger insulator, and if I remember right, that one actually unscrews to give you access to a solder point. So here we go. Let's hope I don't burn my fingers doing this. Don't worry about getting solder on the banana plug. We'll be able to clean that off once we're done. Almost got it. There we go. And I'm going to push the dental pick through the end once we heat it back up some. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the wire from our contact plate. And I've actually already prepared a new wire. Find about 4 inches is a good length. Here's what you do. This happens to be, I think it's 24 gauge wire. I'm going to put the wire through just a little bit there. There we go. Give it a chance to cool. Looks like a pretty good solder joint. And like I said, we'll just snip off any excess. And I'll go back a little bit later and clean that up. We're going to go ahead and attach the wire to our contact plate. Check our solder joint. That looks good. I'm going to try and route the wire just a little bit so it's ready. Hopefully it doesn't get pinched this time. But there we go. The front and rear frames of the tender are now ready to be installed on the body. Alright, it's finally time to install the trucks and the frames to the body. But there are just a couple of things to point out before we start. First off, is you'll need to pay attention to the handrails. At the moment, they can move around in basically any position. But once you install the frames, you're going to want to make sure that the handrails go into some little notches here on the end. Right there and right there. Same on the front frame. The other thing to watch out for, we'll turn this around, is to make sure this wire goes into this notch on the DC relay. That's there to just kind of keep it in place. The main important thing here is to make sure it doesn't get pinched. I also added a little length of shrink tube to mine. You may not need to do that. I just noticed there's a little more exposed conductor there than I wanted, and I was afraid it was going to touch the bottom of the whistle plate and cause a short circuit. And the other thing to remember, I think I pointed this out before, but this little insulator has got a notch cut out that matches that solder lug. I'll show you an important trick to get that installed in just a second. So let's go ahead and start with the rear tender frame. And I'm going to go ahead and start to install this insulator block. I'm going to get this solder lug into that notch, and I'm going to go ahead and drop the screw in. And go ahead and get it started just a little bit there. We don't need it tight. We just want it to hold that solder lug in place. going to go ahead and get my ladders adjusted. And starter screws. Now I'm going to install that little fiber insulator there. This is the screw that actually holds this insulator block in place. Next thing to do is to do the front truck. Make sure that the wire is in a place where it's less likely to get pinched, but I find this is kind of inevitable. There's one last screw for the front frame, but we'll get to that in just a second when we turn the tender over. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove this screw, which was holding on that solder lug. But now that it's mostly captured, it should stay in place. Make sure this bus bar goes on top of those little contact plates. And you want it to have a little bit of spring action, but not too much. There we go. And hopefully you can see a little bit that the bus bar is on top of each of these insulators. Now, flip the tender around. Last screw is right here for the front truck. And coal pile. The tender has now been assembled and it's ready for a test.